Hello, college football fans, and welcome to episode 150 of College Football Throwdown. I'm your host, Alex Schmitz, and joining me for this special episode is my dad, Peter Schmitz.
Hello, Husker fans and college football fans.
Hello, everybody. We're here recording in late August. I know it's been a while since our last podcast. We've both been busy getting up to some various travels and things like that, but we're back, and the high holy days of college football are near at last. We're about to have plenty of fun Saturdays to look forward to. But of course, we wanted to do something a little different than usual for our special 150th episode. And we've decided that we're going to talk about conference realignment, which has been a topical thing, especially in the last few weeks when the Pac-12 has kind of fallen apart before our eyes. So we'll be breaking down that, as long as some historical context for like conference realignment over the past, 50 to 100 years. And as well, looking forward to what 2024 is going to bring in terms of the 12-team playoff and the conference situations and things of that nature.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. But before we get into all that, of course, we have to stick with our day one traditions here and crack open our beverages. I have the Golden Road Brewing Company Mango Cart.
Ooh, wow. Okay. And I am drinking right now my traditional Northern Michigan, while I'm in Traverse City, Labatt Blue, which I so love, a nice Canadian Pilsner. But I was enjoying a couple of beverages with your mom and your sister at the pub here in town, which is a new Irish pub that we have, which we love, and drinking some Schmittix, which I fell in love with when we were over in Ireland a year ago for Nebraska's, game over there.
Well, the name certainly fits the Schmitz family.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
All right, here we go. I was recently in Alaska, and I was hoping I could get some Labatt Blue up there because it's a Canadian beer, but they didn't have it at their supermarket.
No. Uh-huh.
So.
Right. They probably had mostly Alaskan beers. I mean, yeah. You're closer to a Labatt Brewing Company brewery probably in L.A. than you were down in Kenai.
That's true. Canada's a big country, as it turns out.
In a big state.
Yeah.
All right. Well, no, Canada's a big country. Yes, that's true.
Yes.
And Alaska's a big state.
Very true. Both are true. All right. So yes, this is our special 150th episode. For some context, we recorded the first episode of the podcast back in June of 2015. So we've been doing this for over 8 years now, which is pretty crazy to think about. And in that time, we've seen a lot of changes, obviously, in the college football landscape between the playoff being introduced and now expanded to 12 teams, and, various conference realignment. And you'll recall that when Texas and Oklahoma left the Big 12, obviously there was a lot of realignment talk at the time, and people were wondering if the Big 12 was going to kind of fall apart. And the Pac-12 kind of chose not to be aggressive at that time and wasn't necessarily looking to take in, some of the other schools from the Big 12. So the Big 12 was able to get some other schools to fill in the gaps that the others had left behind, and sustain itself. And I recall, I don't remember exactly what you said, but I recall at the time I predicted that the Big 12 would be the one to fall apart in the upcoming years, just because, without Texas and Oklahoma, what did they really have? But as it's turned out, the Big 12 has done a good job kind of navigating this new landscape, and the Pac-12 was the one that was going to fall on its face.
That is an accurate description. And I think there's some specific things that we'll get into a little later in the podcast that address, how important timing and understanding your market and things of that nature, which the Big 12 maybe had a better grasp on than the Pac-12, and ultimately was those decisions, were the cornerstone of the Big 12 finding themselves where they are, and the Pac-12 finding themselves where they are at the Pac-4 now.
Very true. So in terms of the specifics, obviously we've been talking on the podcast in the past about how the Pac-12 is going through ongoing media talks for this media deal, and there were rumors, months ago that Arizona is looking to go to the Big 12, and we had the whole thing where San Diego State left the Mountain West, because they were going to go join the Pac-12, or was it the Big 12 maybe?
No, it was the Pac-12.
It was the Pac-12. Yeah, they were going to go join the Pac-12, and then they weren't, though. There was some miscommunication there, and then they were kind of left in lurch and being like, hey, can we go back to the Mountain West, actually? Not have to pay our exit fee or whatever, so that was some awkwardness. So everybody knew that there was stuff bubbling under the surface, but it was still surprising to me how quickly it all came to be, where as of July 27th, Colorado was the first to announce they were officially going back to the Big 12, which is, of course, ironic because they left the Big 12 to come to the Pac-12 about a decade ago. And then just about a week later, Oregon and Washington decided they were going to go to the Big 10, and Arizona State, and Utah all went to the Pac-12. This was after they had been presented with a media deal. This was, from what's been reported, it was a deal from Apple that would have been worth around $20 million per school. This was done
at least.
Right.
At least $20 million.
At least $20 million per school. This was presented to the conference presidents of the various schools by their commissioner, George Kliakov. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And obviously the presidents and athletic commissioners and stuff were not too pleased with that deal because it's quite a bit lower than what even the Big 12 had. They got their media contract figured out late in 2022, and that averaged around $32 million per school. So yeah, the Pac-12 was clearly in a rough negotiating situation, and the schools decided it was time to pack their bags and go where the money is.
Well, exactly. And the bottom line was that in this whole process, I think it's important that we understand that money has driven most of these decisions going back really at least my lifetime, right? At least to the 1960s or whatever. There might have been a few decisions prior to that were exclusively about alignment from an academic standpoint, things of that nature. But in the what I would describe as modern era of college athletics that started in the late 50s, early 60s, almost all these conference decisions that have been made have all been made primarily based on money and fiscal arrangement. And there were secondary benefits that tied academics and specifically research dollars into some of those decisions. But that's the real key here is people needed or felt compelled to, make decisions that were best for their financial future.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And interestingly, I saw there was a story that was published after, all these schools were announced to be leaving. And their claim was that that the Pac-12 was in talks with ESPN, and ESPN offered a $30 million deal per school in the fall of 2022. And at the time, the Pac-12 presidents rejected that, saying they wanted more, closer to $50 million, apparently. And ESPN said, no. And now, the deal they got from Apple was even less than that. So, yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about the dollar, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, now hindsight, it's easy to say, well, shoot, that was a huge mistake with 2020 vision that the Pac-12 schools said no. Actually, it would have been Pac-10 at that point because I think the USC UCLA departure had already happened, yes. And then the $30 $30 million a year per teams that were left. And when that's them not understanding or appreciating two very, very important things in this whole process. Okay. The one is you need to understand what your real value is. You need to understand yourselves, right? If you're a conference, you need to know what your real value is. And secondly, you need to understand how many media partners are legitimately viable and available to you, right? And the Pac-12 thought that ESPN wouldn't walk away, but they did. And that was driven by a number of things. ESPN probably wouldn't have made that $30 million deal even a few months later if the Pac-12 had come back to them, because their circumstance began to deteriorate rapidly, and to the point where ESPN now has gone from a cash cow for the Disney Corporation a few years ago to being a blood-sucking pig at this point, and major layoffs and things like that are happening in ESPN, and you got to wonder, the organizations that are tied to ESPN with contracts, whether ESPN's going to be able to fulfill their obligations based on the fact that their revenue streams have so dramatically shifted.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Between, more and more people cutting cable and them getting outcompeted by a lot of leaner companies that are online, right, doing sports coverage and things like that. They had a lot of high profile hosts and stuff of their various shows that got laid off in this latest round.
Exactly.
As they're trying to kind of compete with this new reality.
So back to this comment about 2020. It's easy to say that, and it clearly is true, that the Pac-12 made a mistake by not seizing on that moment and securing a 30 or 32, million dollar per team type of arrangement for the remaining 10 schools that they had. Had they done that and locked in ESPN, they most likely are still the conference today that's solidly on good footing, if not great footing. They clearly would still have been a tier below the Big Ten and the SEC, but they would have been viable.
Right, about even with the Big 12.
Well, but the Big 12, but at that point, the Big 12 was the one that was still scrambling, at the time of that offer, right? I mean, the Big 12 was the one that was trying to scramble to replace Oklahoma and Texas and had not yet figured out their path. So they did not have an agreement yet.
Okay, I'm gonna look that up real quick.
Yeah, look at that sequence.
By then, they had figured that out.
I don't think they had an agreement yet, because I think ESPN then made the commitment to the Big 12, knowing that they were not going to pursue the Pac-12.
Okay,
it was like it was a one or the other.
Big 12 added its 4 new members in. Wait a minute, that's 2021, September 2021.
They added those 4 new members, but they didn't immediately get a new TV contract at that time.
Right. The contract came in late 2022.
Right. And when did, as we're talking about this sequentially, the timing of when ESPN offered the Pac-12 the $30 million per team? What was the timing of that?
The tweet I saw just said fall 2022.
Fall of 2022. So that was well after those others were established then. Interesting. That's my mistake then. My perception was that the Pac-12, didn't get an offer after the ESPN Big 12 deal was solidified. But you're telling me the opposite, that there was maybe 9 months later that the Pac-12 was offered that $30 million and they declined it. Man, that makes it even worse.
Right.
That makes the decision by the Pac-12 even worse.
So it says the Big 12 deal, Big 12 Inc.'s $2.3 billion media rights deal with ESPN. That was October 31st, 2022. So I think the Big 12 and the Pac-12 then were negotiating with ESPN around the same time.
Well, see, that's when so we're back to what I thought. Okay, that was my recollection of it. And that ESPN really wasn't intending, or could not afford, frankly, to enter into an agreement with both. So the fact that the Big 12 was able to, come to a terms and agree before the Pac-12 was huge, because once that happened, now ESPN was off the table for whoever was left. In this case, it was the Pac-12. So now the Pac-12 was negotiating with basically some regional sports, media companies, and then a bunch of streaming services, because NBC, was locked into, you know, a, a relationship with Notre Dame, and was also working to develop a relationship with the Big Ten, and Fox was deeply invested in the Big Ten, and so I mean, who were your media partners going to be? Maybe CBS. I mean, that might have been an option for them, but CBS was historically tied to the SEC. So, I mean, I don't know what those people in the Pac-12 were thinking in terms of who was going to be their dancing partner once ESPN left the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Not great foresight on their part. And of course, a lot of this goes back, more than 10 years ago to the previous Pac-12 commissioner, Larry Scott, who back in the early 2010s inked a 12-year deal for them, which at the time it was a good in terms of payment and in regards to like what the other conferences were getting paid and stuff. But the big problem with it was that it was a 12-year deal, right? Whereas a lot of the other conferences had much shorter deals. And so that when theirs expired, they were able to negotiate higher numbers, while the Pac-12 was still stuck with these old numbers, essentially.
Right. Well, and also very important in the Larry Scott era was the decision to go with he was offered, or the Pac-12 was offered the opportunity to enter into a partnership, much like the Big Ten has entered into with Fox, right? The Big Ten network is owned, basically, it's a 50-50, or maybe it's 51-49, I don't remember which, relationship between those two entities, right? The Big Ten network is not exclusively owned by the Big Ten. It is a 50-50 deal with Fox, right? And Larry Scott saw that as a negative, and so he wanted to have a distribution, full control of that distribution of the Pac-12 network. Well, they ended up saying no, even though they were offered that in a 50-50 kind of arrangement, I believe, with ESPN at a minimum, and maybe both ESPN and Fox. And they declined that at that time in exchange for the fact that they thought they could make a lot more money if they did it all themselves. Well, the problem is, then if you go all on your own, then you don't have any of the relationships. How are you going to get these entities to sign up to carry your broadcast network, right? You need to have that expertise. That's valuable. And they undervalued that. And so then they ended up with a Pac-12 network that became a bunch of regional networks, and it never really took off. It just never happened. So no one ever watched it. So why would I ever, if I'm a fan of college football and I want to watch some Pac-12 West Coast football, I'm not going to pay a bunch of individual regional network fees to be able to watch a variety of Pac-12 teams. If I had been able to pay one fee, then maybe my cable operator might have done that and included it in, just like they did with the Big Ten network. Even out of the Big Ten footprint, a lot of areas carried Big Ten, right? Mm-hmm. So that strategic decision was a horrible one by Larry Scott, horrible, and just not understanding the circumstance that they were in, right? So we've just covered 2 or 3 now major missteps that occurred at the leadership level of the Pac-12 that led to their demise. Because frankly, their product, just their product, offered more than, say, what the Big 12 could offer minus Texas and Oklahoma. The Big 12 without Texas and Oklahoma did not have population, didn't have any big blue blood names really that they could hang their hat on. They had none of that stuff. But what they did have is they had a bunch of schools with reasonably good fan followings, which you can't say about the Pac-12. So that kind of leads to the second leg of this discussion, which is one of the other reasons why the Pac-12 was having a hard time entering into a relationship is, again, they didn't understand their own value. They didn't understand, and they overvalued what they meant historically. I mean, the Pac-12 historically is the Conference of Champions. They have more NCAA national championships than any other conference in its previous Pac-12 organizationally. You know what I mean? All those
Right.
schools, mostly because of Olympic sports and their tremendous dominance in some of those areas. You know, volleyball, swimming, diving, soccer, you name it. All these different Olympic type sports, they were dominant, right? And but that means nothing because very few of those sports have a huge spectator space, right? You need to have fans. They didn't have any fans, Alex. You
Right.
know, especially if you subtract USC and UCLA.
Right. Well, and even, right, I think you were mentioning in some of our podcasts last year about seeing these pictures of the UCLA stadium, this beautiful, round
Pasadena.
stadium,
Yeah.
there in Pasadena. And it's, not even half full. It's less than that,
Oh yeah.
and, partially because, there's just a lot of other things going on the West Coast. We've got good weather and stuff like that, especially, Southern California and stuff, so football isn't the kind of singular focus that it is in certain areas of like the Midwest and the Southeast and things like that.
Okay. Okay. Without getting us ratings changes on our podcast, I'm calling total BS on that. Okay. I'm so sick of that. And you, as a Midwesterner at born and bred, should understand this, but maybe you've been out there too long. I am not on board with this. Oh, there's so much else to do. That's crap. Okay. Because you know what? You Southern Californians, you don't do that stuff. Most Southern Californians hardly spend any time at the beach. So you have beaches, but you don't go there because it takes too damn long to get there. The traffic's too bad. I don't want to hassle with it. So what do you guys do? The bottom line is you don't have any commitment to your alma mater. The bottom line is you don't have the passion for your alma mater and its sports teams like other schools in other regions of the countries do. And I don't buy that there's nothing to do in the Midwest or there's nothing to do in the Heartland or the Southeast or whatever. That's crap. We have as much variety of social opportunity and activities to do as the West Coast. It's crap. Bottom line is they're apathetic. They don't care. Their passion is gone, and that is on the individual schools. And that's where I want to go to this next level of dissecting the Pac-12's specific demise. Is it really comes back to those institutions, right? The presidents of those schools who picked the leaders like Larry Scott and this new guy. Those are the people that need to be held accountable, for the fact that they didn't take care of their own house. UCLA, it should have been an embarrassment to the whole leadership and administration of UCLA that their fan attendance at major sporting events held in a beautiful facility like the Rose Bowl would have those kinds of pathetic numbers, okay? Because UCLA as an institution is far larger than the University of Nebraska in terms of student population, alumni base, access to people. I'm sorry, there is no excuse for them not filling that stadium, or at least filling it 3/4 full. That's crap.
Mm-hmm.
So my whole point is those people need to look at themselves. They have to point the thumb, as Bo Pelini used to always say. You gotta point the thumb because it was on them.
Right.
It was on them.
Well, and so for the record, to clear my name here on this podcast, I agree with you, obviously, that there is plenty of stuff to do out in the Midwest, and that particular thing, I think it is a factor in the Pac-12 schools, but it's a small factor amongst much bigger ones, like the fact what you mentioned about the apathy.
Exactly.
And
I think that's a convenient excuse.
right. And also, I wanted to mention when you were talking about the presidents and stuff, one other factor that specifically I believe led to USC and UCLA leaving, earlier than everybody else, right? They left in 2022 and obviously kind of kickstarted all of this process. Was that when Larry Scott signed that 12-year deal, there was an equal share amongst all the schools. So obviously
Right.
for, the California schools, that were bringing in more eyeballs, certainly than like Oregon State, let's say, and they're not getting as much money, that's not going to make them happy. And so they had a bit more eager feet than some of the other schools.
You're right on, and let's take that as a jump off point to go back in time. Okay, so here's I'm going to start this conference transition stuff in 1993. Okay, Alex, and I'll explain why in a little bit. There were changes that occurred, before 1993, obviously, because the Pac. I think the Pac was originally the Pac-6. The Big 12 was originally the Big 6, and then it became the Big 8, and then eventually it became the Big 12, right? And there were other conferences that came and went. Like in the case of the Big 12, it was the leftovers of a disbanded and failed Southwestern Conference that effectively made Texas and Texas A&M and Texas Tech and Baylor available for the Big 8 to go and invite them to join. Okay, and so there were changes that happened, obviously, over time, but I'm going to start in 93 because I would say between early 1970s to 1993, so about 20-year period, there was a period of relative stability among the major what we now call the Power 5 conferences. There was relative stability in that group, okay, as
Mm-hmm.
well as those big names that were independent. Notre Dame, BYU, Florida State, Miami. They were all independent schools,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And so there was a great period of stability. And then in 93, the Big 10 invited Penn State to join the
Well,
conference.
actually, I have two notes to add to that because I did
Okay,
my
go
own
ahead.
research as well. So I have one note that in 1978, that was actually when I believe it was the Pac-8 at the time, added Arizona
Right.
and Arizona State to
And
become the
Arizona State.
Pac-10. And
Right.
apparently, much of the conference wasn't necessarily on board with expanding, but USC and UCLA threatened to leave if the conference didn't expand. So that kind of got the other schools to agree to add in the Arizona schools.
Interesting.
And then also, Penn State was actually offered to join the Big Ten in 1990, but they didn't
Right.
actually join until 93.
Correct. Okay. Yep. Good. Yep. So, but the bottom line is you had about 20 years there where it was relatively stable, right? By modern standards, by recent year standards, right? The last decade has been much more dynamic than those two previous decades, right? So the bottom line though is that there were certain major players that were huge influencers in all of this. Uh, One of them would be the University of Texas, and I'm going to tie this together on a number of things. And one of them would be the University of Nebraska. One of them is going to be USC. Okay, uh, and that's not even considering the individual decisions, say by independent schools like Florida State and Miami to join the ACC. Those were two independent schools, and so that was individual schools choosing to join a conference for the first time, right? Notre Dame choosing to enter into a fairly intimate relationship with the ACC and everything but football, and even a special arrangement in football. So those are all individual schools doing this. But in terms of conferences and influence within conferences, USC had a massive influence in the Pac-10, Pac-12, Pac-8, going back further, and the University of Texas had a huge influence in the Southwest Conference, and then after the Big Eight or the Big 12 was formed, had obviously a huge influence in the Big 12, and Nebraska had a huge influence in the Big Eight, and then in the Big 12, and then ultimately choosing to leave because of confrontations between the expectation and desires of Texas and Nebraska being not in the same in the same vein, right? But what I've recently learned is USC was very critical in this because if we want to go back to the early 2010s, the 2010, 2011, when Nebraska made the decision to leave the Big 12 and join the Big 10, there were a number of factors playing into there. And in that same time frame, there was conversations afoot because the Big 12 was in the midst of trying to figure out what they were going to do with their media rights. And Nebraska wanted to get everyone to commit collectively and provide their grant of rights together. Texas was unwilling to do that. They were unwilling to do that. And as a result, because they were in side negotiations with not everybody was public knowledge about yet, they were already in side negotiations about a potential Longhorn network with ESPN. So they had no interest in getting into anything that was going to give away all their grants of rights, right? Including their second tier rights. But they had also, Texas, I believe it was Texas A&M, there were 4 schools from the Big 12 that were negotiating. Oklahoma were negotiating about possibly moving to the Pac-12, and that was almost a done deal back in that same time frame. Before Nebraska left, before Colorado left, there were 4 schools that were going to leave the Big 12 and go to the Pac-12, but USC nixed the deal. At that time, this is where USC comes in. They nixed that deal because they did not want Texas coming in without committing their grant of rights. Texas wasn't willing to do that because USC did not want to have Texas come in and then have an additional media rights deal that gave them a huge financial advantage over everyone else in the conference. So USC said, no, we're not agreeing to this. Okay, so USC was a key player in making that not happen. And as a result of that not happening, then Texas and those schools reverted their attention back to preserving and setting up an arrangement within the Big 12, but they never could come to agreements with Nebraska. And then Nebraska was obviously in conversation along with a few other schools at that time. I believe Kansas was in conversations. Missouri was in conversations with the Big Ten at that time, and Texas was in conversations with the Big Ten, ironically, at that time. Well, once Nebraska, it was clear to Nebraska that we were not going to be able to get an equitable solution where there was shared revenue among all the schools, that Texas wanted to keep that extra level for their own benefit because they knew that they had greater leverage than everybody else. Then Nebraska felt it was no longer in their best interest to stay in the Big 12. So they went to the Big 10 and said, we would like to accept an invitation if you would present one. And then the negotiation started with him and Delaney, with Osborne and Delaney, and that's history. And we went to the Big 10. Now, that opened the door for Texas to get their sweetheart deal, which they got. So they had a separate advantage over everyone else in the Big 12. And Oklahoma is the one, in my opinion, was the enabler. They were the ones that they basically said, our greatest success has been during a period of time when we hitched our wagon to Texas. We're going to keep our wagon hitched to Texas because wherever they go, we're going. And that has worked in their favor almost every time. So I understand why Oklahoma did it. I don't respect it, but I understand why they did it.
Yep.
So there's my layout of that whole sequence. Okay. And it's interesting that USC and Texas were both critical in saying both yes and no at certain times to sway the implications. And ironically, both USC and Texas ultimately bailed on their partners to new conferences.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I saw in some of my articles as well that they were kind of saying, well, with 2020 hindsight, the Pac-12 should have fought harder to get Texas and Oklahoma and those other Big 12 schools in the fold back at that time, because then they would have been a very strong conference with, USC, UCLA, Washington, plus all of those new additions, Oregon. And we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. The Big 12 would be the one that would have collapsed back at that time.
Absolutely true.
So, yeah, the story of the Big 12 surviving, whether it's even if it's, with a scrap of what they used to be, but they're still kicking and living to this day. You gotta admire that little story of how they somehow
absolutely
keep going.
When we left the Big 12, BB was the commissioner, and he was a weak commissioner, and wasn't able to pull it off at all. And I think that was part of what made it easier for Nebraska to move on. It was clear that they did not have enough consensus. Nebraska did not have enough support and consensus among the other members, because everyone else was so scared of Texas leaving that they were willing to bend to Texas's request, where Nebraska was not willing to. And I think that the Kansas and the Missouris and the Kansas States, Iowa States of the Big 8 days didn't think Nebraska, with all of our deep tradition in the Big 8, they didn't believe we would actually leave. And I think they were probably caught a little surprised and flat-footed that Nebraska would in fact follow through on their threat that, hey, if we can't get this equitable arrangement, we're gone, because we don't want to compete in a world where Texas already has every damn advantage, and now they're going to have a huge financial advantage. Screw that. We don't want any part of it. Okay, we're going to go to a place in the Big Ten, which had historically, until just recently, always been about equity, right, and about equal treatment. And there were huge academic benefits for the University of Nebraska as well. So there were other reasons that made it easy to choose the Big Ten. But now the landscape's starting to change, because clearly, Oregon and Washington are coming in as not 100% members, at least not yet. But I think that at least the Big Ten has provided them a pathway to equity once they do certain things.
Right. And then, of course, just talking about my lifetime, of course, the biggest kind of phase of conference realignment before all that, or I guess it was, somewhat aligned with the Nebraska leaving and stuff like that, but it was the collapse of the Big East, right?
Right.
Which existed from 1979 through 2013. But one of their problems was in their original setup was how they had teams that were in the Big East for non-football sports, and then teams that were in there specifically for football sports, and that kind of created some inequities, and tough balancing acts that I think made them unstable. And so when all that stuff was going down with the, with the Pac-12 and the Big 12 and the Big 10, in the early 2010s, other schools were looking to what are our options, because we're not necessarily happy with where we are either.
Right. Yeah. And, because the Big East was never really a prominent football conference, that doesn't quite show up on the radar, like a Power 5 conference that had football as a main, visible entity, right?
Yeah. Well, and I don't know about you, but, I was looking at the college football Reddit, when I saw the heavy rumors were starting that like Colorado was going to leave, and that all these schools were getting nervous and stuff, and so I was following the day-to-day, postings on Twitter from all these reporters and stuff. And you might remember there was even a moment where it was like, it seemed like for a moment that like the commissioner had done a Hail Mary and managed to save the conference, overnight.
Oh, yeah.
And then like the next day, everybody left.
well, he had this meeting, right? They said, we're not going to talk about it during football media days, right? And so they said, we're going to talk about it right after that. And so then he had a meeting with all the big boys at that time, and he unveiled all the details. And when he shared with them that, yeah, this is a great deal, but it's just not guaranteed. Only 20 million of it is guaranteed. And then the rest of it is based on subscriptions, which again, he was throwing it back out to those presidents of those institutions to say, hey guys, this is in your house. You guys have got to inspire and motivate your fan bases, your alumnus, okay, to actively and aggressively sign up for these streaming services so that the revenue then gets produced, right? And then everybody will be happy because then, the sky's the limit. You start having all this, because there's plenty of people out there, you're right. The population out there in the West is plenty big enough, but it meant they actually wasn't guaranteed. They had to do the work before they got the money.
Right.
And it was not guaranteed.
Right.
And I think a bunch of them at that point, then all of a sudden, the idea of entering the Big Ten at a partial share, which is still way more than $20 million a year, and with a path to full membership and full share, within some reasonable period of time for schools like Washington and Oregon, all of a sudden that looked attractive to them in a way that it maybe didn't previously. Because I think way back when we offered USC and UCLA, full membership. We had conversations and went through the vetting process and determined that we would take Washington, Oregon as institutions, but we wouldn't take them at full share because we did not want them to jeopardize the per school payment. Other than that, where UCLA and USC were carrying enough mail that they could bring it in and not negatively affect the television arrangement, the revenues for media. Oregon and Washington were not in that same fold. So right at that point in time, I think Oregon and Washington were not yet willing to concede that. They wanted to wait and see what the Pac-12 would say, because clearly there's going to be a bunch more expense for those, right? I mean, the reality is the distance between, say, the University of Washington and UCLA, I don't know how many miles that is, but it's probably not a lot more than it is from UCLA to Nebraska, to Lincoln, Nebraska. It's maybe a little more, but in terms of air flight miles, which both of them are plane flights, not that much. Right. Maybe a half hour.
But because I was telling some of this news to your brother AJ, because I was staying with him recently on this trip.
Up to Alaska.
And when I told him, that the Pac-12 had fallen apart and Washington and Oregon are coming to the Big Ten, he's like, oh, that's crazy. Like, these flights are, going to be wild. And, the players have to take extra time off from school just to accommodate that, right? Because imagine flying from LA all the way over to Rutgers,
Maryland.
And things like that. You're basically going across the whole country. So it's definitely a different world now.
Time isn't that much different, because when you're in a plane that's flying 500 miles an hour, maybe it's an hour or two, but 3 time zones,
right?
That's harder, right? That physically is harder. And so, for football, not going to be a big deal. I don't think. Not going to be that big a deal, especially when you can schedule things so that you're not doing that in back-to-back weeks, right? So there can be some accommodations to make sure that a USC, for example, doesn't have to fly to Maryland one week and then the very next week fly to Penn State, right? So, or if they did something like that, they would do it in such a way that the team would stay out east after a week at Maryland, and Maryland would provide them the opportunity to have access to their practice facility or something for a few days. And then Penn State would do the same, and somehow they would stay out east for the 2-week period, right? So there's all kinds of coordination that can go on to minimize that travel cost and the travel physical demand on the student athletes. Right. With all the remote capability to do remote learning that now exists due to the COVID experience, I think that is not that big a deal. The bigger thing is in all the other sports, where you have sports like basketball or volleyball, where you play 2 matches a week. Well, now, if you're trying to fly back and forth 2 times in a week, now that's a problem, right? That starts to add up, and not only is it expensive, but the physical toll on the athlete is quite quite enormous. But again, can you do some things where someone flies out, they play two schools in the same area, and they stay out for 2 weeks or for the whole week or whatever, right? And they accommodate. So I think there's going to be some effort to accommodate that.
Right.
And now you've got Washington, Oregon. So you've got 4 schools on the West Coast that are all that same West Pacific time zone.
Yeah. Just hearing you talk about that is just making me think, I don't envy, the Big 12 official who's in charge of like scheduling, in baseball or volleyball, these sports that play way more often, because it must be a real mess.
Oh, yeah. Well, and, one thing we were going to just touch on was, the Big Ten just finally figured out how they were going to do this scheduling, and they were all proud of this system that they'd come up with, where, we were going to handle scheduling with USC and UCLA, and it was going to still allow every athlete to experience all the schools in the 4 years that they would be at a Big Ten university, right? Like you would get the opportunity to play all those schools at least once. Now that blows up and you got to start over again, but you really don't. What they're probably going to do is they're just going to put more of a priority on travel, for people like, say, Nebraska and Iowa. Those that are the furthest west, we're going to probably play those other Western schools with greater frequency, is what's going to happen. They're going to take our schedule that already has been announced for 24 and 25 and 26 and 27, and they're going to simply switch out maybe a Rutgers or a Maryland game for a Washington and Oregon game. Right. And so they're going to do those kinds of things and tweak it rather than reinventing it again.
Right. That's what I think. And that's what I saw as well. There was a comment from somebody at the Big 12 basically said, like, we're working on it, but it's not going to be a drastic change from what we previously announced. We're still going to keep certain teams having their certain rivals, right, that they always play every year.
Yep.
Though in some of those discussions, I've seen talk of a 10 conference games instead of 9.
Yes.
Which to me sounds crazy when we're living in a world where the Big 10 is playing 10 and the SEC is playing 8. That just is crazy.
I agree. Well, and that's the thing. I think we would like to do that, but because the SEC are a bunch of pussies, we won't be able to do that until the SEC steps up, right? And takes it seriously that they need to have competitive schedules. And I'm just, I have a very strong feeling about the whole SEC scheduling cop out.
Yes.
And anybody who doesn't think that has a huge impact. And so that's where I want to sit down and have a one-on-one conversation with everybody who's part of the college football playoff committee and get their absolute guaranteed ironclad commitment that win-loss record isn't as important as the quality of the opponents and how many quality opponents that people have to play.
Right.
Yeah. And it's not just about, does this, a quality opponent isn't just this person or this team rather has a good record. Quality opponent has to do with what resources do they have available to them? What are the things that make them able to compete week in and week out within this league, and the resources that they have available to them? All those things matter in terms of how you view an opponent. Mm-hmm. Because just because someone has a bad record doesn't mean that they're not a viable opponent that has great coaching and great facilities and great training staff and all the other things, great recovery facilities, versus a team that doesn't have that stuff.
Yeah, very true. And so as I was following all this news about, the Pac-12 teams leaving, or being expected to leave and stuff, although this 150th episode is obviously kind of a celebration for us for reaching, our 150th milestone here. At the same time, it is kind of a sad occasion because, the Pac-12 is basically dead. There's only 4 teams left within it, and even they are trying to leave currently. And so there were a lot of posts online I saw from, just people like mourning the lost rivalries and the history of the conference. It dates all the way back to 1915 in its earliest form as the Pacific Coast Conference, which was at the time Cal, Washington, Oregon, and Oregon State. And it's evolved and shrunk and grown in different forms. Apparently, that was disbanded in 1959 because of a paying players scandal, and then it was reformed into the Athletic Association of Western Universities and grew into the Pac-6 and then the Pac-8 and Pac-10 from there.
Interesting.
So, from that aspect, I do understand certainly where people are coming from because, in this modern day college football, right, those sorts of regional rivalries and, our historical matchups matter less and less in the face of big TV money.
Right. Oh, well, and I agree. I liked it better when we were part of the Big Eight. I would go back to the Big Eight in a heartbeat because those were all regional rivals. They were teams we had played for literally 100 years in many cases, and they were mostly drivable distance. We could drive to away games, right? You could get up in the morning on Saturday morning and drive to Lawrence, Kansas, to Manhattan, Kansas, to, Ames, Iowa, or whatever, right? I mean, all of those schools, Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, were within driving distance of Lincoln, Nebraska. But as the television dollar became way more important than the stadium dollar, right? It used to be, and one of the things that made Nebraska successful in that era was we had a huge stadium that we fully filled every week. So we had a multi-million-dollar advantage over most of our competitors. My brother Mike, who coached at the University of Kansas under Glenn Mason, he talks about how, as much as he disliked Nebraska, it was night and day difference when Kansas would play Nebraska. Okay. Schools, especially within the conference, there are rules where you exchange tapes with the other team the week prior to you playing them. So Kansas would take their game tapes from that season. I don't know how many they would have to go back, 3 games or whatever, but there was some standard. And so and there were different views, right? You would have the 22 view, the 11 view. You would have behind the goalpost. There were like 5 or 6 views, and so all schools would have that kind of video, and they were videotapes, right? Just like you remember when you were growing up, right? I'd have videotapes of Nebraska football. Yep. Well, they would have those tapes, right? And when they would, that was one of Mike's jobs his first year when he was a GA, was putting those packets together, and they would get those tapes, and they were just like ones you would have bought at Kmart or Walmart or whatever, and they were handwritten on them what they were, and he'd wrap them all up, he'd put them in some tape, and he'd put them in a box or whatever and send them up to Nebraska, right, with some information handwritten on it. What he would get back from Nebraska was all typed out on a beautiful tablet, a printer, what do I want to say, sticker type thing,
right?
All organized. All the cassette tapes were in red and white because it was Nebraska, and boom, 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 boom. It was all in this beautiful box that was designed specifically for that, right? So even back then, there was a huge difference between the way Nebraska handled stuff, first class, and say the way Kansas handled things at that time. And it was just about budget. It was about money and that sort of stuff. Why? Because Kansas would struggle to get a full stadium of back then, 40, 50,000, and Nebraska was getting 70,000 people every single game. That means a lot. Well, now over time, now that revenue is pale in comparison to the revenue you get from those TV contracts. So now it's mostly about the TV contract. So that's the other evolution that's happened, basically starting, in the early 70s when television was very limited, to where by the late 90s, most games were on TV or at least available by pay-per-view. And by the 2000s, you had internet and streaming and all that sort of stuff starting to take hold.
Right. Very true. Yeah, that's a fun anecdote from Uncle Mike there.
Yeah.
So catching us up to the present day, the 4 schools that are left in the Pac-12, as it's still called, is University of California, Oregon State, Stanford, and Washington State. And we've seen reports that both Stanford and Cal have been looking to join the ACC. It's kind of their getaway card. And so far, the ACC has rebuffed those advances, or they're still in negotiations trying to figure things out. What is your prediction there? Do you think that some of those schools do end up in the ACC, or do they go to like the Mountain West? How do things play out?
Okay. Man, you're putting me on the spot. I wanted to put you on the spot.
I got there first.
You did. Okay. So here's my thoughts. Cal and Stanford have also been linked to the Big Ten, not just the ACC, right? And I think there is a scenario where the Big Ten, in fact, offers Stanford for sure to join the Big Ten. Okay, probably at a diminished initial revenue stream, much like they've offered to Washington and Oregon, right? And then a slow buy-in if Stanford comes along with Notre Dame.
Well, sure. If you could reel Notre Dame into it, then Big Ten would take that in a heartbeat.
Give me a moment. Okay, here's the thing. One of the strong arguments that Notre Dame has made in the past for why they weren't interested in joining the Big Ten was because they had so many independent relationships, long-term, very long-standing independent relationships with schools outside the Big Ten that they had annual games with. Their annual game with USC goes back many, many decades. Their annual game with Stanford, again, similarly, many, many decades. Their annual game with Navy, also many decades. But then they also had relationships within the Big Ten. Like until they got into their association with the ACC, Notre Dame had played Michigan or Michigan State, if not both schools, almost every year for decades, right? And only after they joined this ACC alliance arrangement that they have did that start to diminish, right? So when you start looking at how an independent like Notre Dame makes their schedule, and them not wanting to disconnect from institutions like Stanford and USC and other traditional rivals that they've had, that seemed like a pretty viable argument. Well, the Big Ten has partially addressed that by bringing USC into the fold, right? They have Michigan and Michigan State already into the fold. If they were to bring Stanford into the fold, then all of a sudden the Big Ten should look very attractive to a Notre Dame to simply join the conference and be a part of that same thing and not have to give up those long-standing relationships, right?
Right.
So an argument can be made that Stanford can be the carrot, the dangled carrot that the Big Ten can then secure, and then come to Notre Dame with an offer that says, "Hey, we'll give you full membership because you're going to bring that. We're going to give you the guaranteed annual relationships with USC and Stanford and Michigan State every year, and you'll play Michigan almost every year or something along those lines, so that you get a bunch of your traditional rivalries, and we can bring the academics of Notre Dame and Stanford into the Big Ten and our academic consortium as well." And all of a sudden that might start to make some sense to somebody like Notre Dame. So that's where I see Stanford getting an opportunity to join the Big Ten, which is where I think they would like to land. That would be their preference. Now, Cal is also a phenomenal academic institution and would fit the Big Ten footprint from an academic standpoint. The problem is Cal has no fan base, and their athletic side does not rise to the level to be a factor for the Big Ten. So Stanford would have to sever themselves from Cal to make that a reality, right?
Right.
Where the ACC maybe is more willing to bring Cal and Stanford in together because it not only gives them a West Coast anchor, it also brings tremendous academics into an ACC that already is got some pretty damn good academic schools in it.
Right. Well, one thing you just kind of made me think of or reminded me of is we've always talked, right, that Notre Dame has been very protective of their football independence over the years, right? It has rebuffed many advances from the Big Ten to join.
Right.
And I think the Notre Dame president even made a comment recently during all this realignment saying, like, we're happy with our independence, yada, yada. But we've always said that if we get to the point where we have these giant super conferences, then the money differential would be so great that it would kind of force Notre Dame to finally make a decision on that.
Right.
And now we're in a situation where the SEC is 16 teams, the Big 12 is 16 teams, and the Big 10 is now going to be 18 teams. So we're kind of at that point now where we've got these super conferences. So
well, we not quite. We need one more tumbler to fall, and that might be the ACC. See, there's rumblings, of course, among the ACC members because they did an even worse job than the Pac-12. They signed their grant of rights away till 2036, which is crazy because they did that, before COVID. So they did that, and they signed away their grant of rights for like 20 years. That has put them in a bind now.
Right.
And so there's some schools like Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, that are not thrilled with their current situation. And so the right combination of schools from there, and that's where I could see a scenario where if Stanford, if the Big Ten could make real forays into Stanford and Notre Dame, then they might even look to get 4 from the ACC.
Wow.
Get like a Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, Miami, or I don't know, somebody else from the ACC. It's escaping me right now. Wake Forest, who are good high academic institutions, and also great athletic institutions, and then basically be a national conference. 24 teams, and then you do 3 8-team divisions, right? And you have some kind of a playoff at the end with the winners of those 3 divisions plus a wild card, or maybe you have 5 wild cards and then you have an 8-game or an 8-team playoff at the end to become the eventual Big Ten champion. You see what I'm saying? Doing something like that.
Right.
And then be done. At that point, we're done. And the SEC has had the benefit of remaining a regional conference, right? They're Southeast. The Big Ten has already embraced being a national conference. The thing they're missing at this point is the Southeast. So if they could get a Florida State and a Miami and a Clemson and a North Carolina, that'd be a fearsome foursome out of the southeastern United States. And now they would have everything. They'd have Maryland there. They'd have Rutgers in the East, Penn State in the East, all the Midwest, some Heartland and Nebraska and Iowa, and then West Coast.
Yeah, that would be pretty crazy for them to jump from 14 to 24 in the span of like 2 years or whatever. But it could happen. I don't think it's impossible.
I think the 2, Stanford, Notre Dame, and they might just stop there. But I could see the tumblers start to fall. Then the SEC expands and gobbles up some of those same schools they'd go after from the ACC. The ACC kind of falls into itself because it can't compete financially. And now you have the Big 12, who is kind of that gatherer of the remaining wheat. And then you have the 2 superpowers of SEC and the Big 10.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, so that leads nicely into our last main topic, which is, of course, is talking about the 2024 12-team playoff, right? Once again,
Yes.
the folks at the playoff committee, put together this nice format of like how it's all going to work, with the 6 champions, right? Which is going to be the 5 Power 5 conference champions plus 1 from the group of 5, the best, highest ranked team from the group of 5 would all be guaranteed. And then you have 6 at-larges. But now that's
Right.
all gone up in smokes because the Pac-12 is dissolved.
Yeah. It's
Right.
no longer a Power 5. It's now a Power 4.
Exactly. And if what you just said comes to pass, it could even be a Power 3 if the ACC were to collapse. But for now, we're just going to go with the assumption the ACC is going to stick around. So the question is...
And I think that's accurate.
Yeah. So the question is, how do you structure it? And I've seen 2 propositions pop out there. One is basically a more simple one, which is 5 plus 7, which basically says you now have the 4 main conference champions plus the 1 at large from, the group of 5, right? The lesser conferences. So basically it's exactly the same. You just have an additional at large team. So there's 7 of those instead of 6.
Yeah.
Or the other proposition I saw, which I am definitely not a fan of, was basically just that I guess it would be just the top 12 ranked teams, by the polls get it. And there's no conference champion guarantees.
I would hate that too. Absolutely hate that. Because again, what poll do you use? Who are these people that are voting these polls? And even if you have a select committee, they've already demonstrated their inability to be able to evaluate teams based on factors that are more nuanced than win-loss record, right? And RPIs and digital polls that basically look at win-loss records of win-loss records of win-loss records, and not look at the circumstances of the leagues and the teams that they're playing against and the resources of those teams, so you can really partition the difference between a team. You can't tell me that a team that's a 9-win team in the American Athletic Conference, the AAC, is better than a 500 Big Ten team who's had to play Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and Wisconsin. And so they're a 500 team, right? But if you look at their losses, you realize that team, if they were playing in that AAC, might very well won the league.
Right.
Right. And so you can't just look at win-loss record. You've got to be more savvy than that. You've got to be able to look at the strength of that and look at the pounding, what the implication is of losing players to injury and stuff because of the type of opponents that you're playing week in and week out. All those things matter. And we haven't come up with a human group that is capable of doing that. Certainly not a computer that's capable of doing that. So I don't want any part of that.
Right. So yeah, and I agree with everything you just said. So I think the 5-7 model seems like the easiest way, similar to what we were just talking about with the Big Ten conference schedules, right? Just make a slight alteration to what you had already agreed on and move forward with that.
But the thing is that plays into the SEC's 8 conference games scenario.
Right.
Because those at-larges now are being selected by this committee that doesn't have enough intelligence and savvy to be able to understand that, there's a difference between, a 7-5 Big Ten team that's played 9 conference games and, an 8-4 or 9-3 SEC team that's played, 8 conference games and played 4 nobodies in which they don't even leave their region of the country, right? They don't play ever in cold weather, ever. They never play in inclement weather.
Right.
Okay. So to me, that's the kind of crap that those teams should be punished in their evaluation process for not having done the things they needed to do to strengthen their non-conference schedule. If you're only going to play 8 conference games, that's fine. You guys don't want to play your own conference opponents, that's your own call. But we're going to punish you for playing these nobody non-conferences in convenient spots in your schedule to accommodate your injury recovery and all the other things that you're doing, because that's not comparable to these teams that are striving to play their own conference opponents.
Yeah, I will say the SEC does have one advantage over the Big Ten, and that's that they were smart enough to not name themselves after a number. So as they expand, there's not a contradiction with them.
That's true. But see, to me, the whole Big Ten thing, that ship sailed when they added Penn State in 1993. So,
yep,
get over it, man. That was decades ago.
Yeah,
it's just a name. It's just a name. but what's more important to me is a recognition that the SEC is doing things strategically to make their record better. Okay, that's really easily overcome if you are the selection committee. Don't play in to their game. Right. Look at the team for what they really have done, what they've really accomplished over the course of the season based on all the factors, and then begin to punish them a little bit for the fact that they choose the easy path, and reward those who choose the more challenging path. And if you start to reward those, then the SEC, even if they didn't play more conference games, would start increasing the severity. Let me use an analogy in a different sport. In volleyball, okay, women's volleyball, which I follow, the NCAA changed the way they evaluate teams, and rather than doing, identifying in advance the 4 schools that are going to host the 4 regions of the NCAA volleyball tournament, those are now awarded based on a ranking, right, of the top 4 teams selected by the NCAA, and that selection criteria includes, the severity or the difficulty of the schedules they play. So if you're a team that plays a bunch of nobodies to get to 20 wins in a volleyball season, or 22 wins, then you're going to get punished because you didn't play tough opponents. You're going to get rewarded if you play tough opponents. Right. Does that make sense?
Yep.
I think it's not that hard for the NCAA, or the College Football Playoff Committee, I should say, because the NCAA has nothing to do with this. The College Football Playoff Committee needs to come up with a system like that, where teams are truly rewarded for playing tough teams.
Right. Well, and obviously we've talked about this plenty before, and it's one of the beautiful but also challenging things about college football is that we don't play that many games, right? You've got 12 games in a regular season. So a single loss, matters a lot more for a football team than it does for a volleyball team that plays twice that many games, or even, 3 times as many if you're talking about basketball and some of these other sports.
Right.
So they just can't get it out of their heads,
Right. Exactly. And, but it wouldn't be that hard for you to scrutinize when you're evaluating a team that's got, 2 losses or 3 losses in the SEC, and one that has 4 losses in the Big Ten, and being able to legitimately and logically justify why you're choosing the 4-loss Big Ten team over the 3-loss SEC team, when you look at not only who they lost to, but when they lost, what games they played before they played tough games, and things of that nature. And you begin to see that the path that the SEC school took was easier than the path that was taken by the Big Ten school, both in terms of physical things like weather and those factors, as well as the actual teams they played.
Right. Yep. Well, and I'd like to believe, perhaps being naive here, but I'd like to believe that in this new world, which we will soon be entering, this 2023 season, which we're about to arrive at, is really the end of many eras, right? Between the end of the 4-team playoff, as well as now the end of the Pac-12 and the start of all these new conferences in 2024 and stuff. It's
Yep.
a more significant year than usual, I would say, in that regard.
No doubt.
But I'd like to think that in 2024, when we've got, okay, the new conferences are solidified, so the SEC has Texas, Oklahoma, and the Big Ten will now have Washington, Oregon, USC, and UCLA added, and we'll have the 9 conference games, presumably, that maybe then the rankings people will look at that and give the Big Ten more respect than they did in the past, because we have added 4 strong schools to the roster, So I'm open to the fact that, with a new playoff system of 12 teams and new schools in the conferences, we might get a little bit better consideration of strength of schedule. But I'm not betting on it. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Well, I'm hopeful that you are right, and I would love it if that were the result. But I hope to be there, to be having conversations with you on this podcast about those decisions when they have to pick those 12 teams come a year from now or a year and a half from now, when that's happening, to see if they have learned from the errors of their past. Because again, they don't see it as an error. They think it's completely legitimate, and the SEC schools are just giggling all the way to the bank with this. Right. And it almost seems like there's a power structure now that's in place to sustain that for the SEC, and they're just laughing at the Big Ten for self-induced punishment that the Big Ten has chosen to do by playing the 9th game. It's just stupid. Right. And the Big Ten should have never done that. If their goal was to win national championships and to begin to contend with the SEC as the premier conference in college football specifically, they should have gone to 8 games or went to the SEC and the commissioners gotten together and shook hands and made an agreement that they were both going to 9 games. Then that would have been great.
Yep. But such is life. So we'll see how this new world of college football develops. We'll be coming to you with another podcast this week as we break down all the stuff that's been going on in Nebraska fall camp. There's plenty of news in that world for us to get into. And then, of course, we'll be getting into the proper college football season starting next week as we look at Nebraska's first game against Minnesota and all the exciting stuff to come.
Right. And hopefully previewing the historic Volleyball Day in Nebraska event, which your mother and I and your sister will be attending. We're leaving from Traverse City, Michigan to drive to Lincoln, Nebraska to be a part of a 90,000 plus people that will watch 2 women's volleyball games, hopefully in the stadium, and break the record not only for the most people to watch a NCAA women's volleyball game, but potentially any women's sport in the history of the world.
Very cool. Yes, it's exciting times. So thank you all out there for listening to us for 150 episodes. If you've been with us from the beginning, or if you've been with us more recently, we're happy to have either one of you. So you can reach out to us at huskerpete13@gmail.com. You can also search for our podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you search for College Football Throwdown, you'll find us there. You can leave us a rating or a review. We love hearing from the fans. So thank you out there for listening. And thank you, Dad, for joining me for 150 episodes. And here's to 150 more.
There you go. It's been a lot of fun, Alex. I know we do this as much for ourselves and as anybody that might choose to listen, and I hope those who listen enjoy it, but it really is a therapeutic thing and something that has always allowed me an excuse to share and continue to share a passion with my son. So thank you, Alex, for all that you do to make this happen.
No problem, Dad. So until next time, go Big Red.
Go Big Red.